to like marry those core mechanics of agility and Ghost Runner that I'm really digging, marry that with the puzzles, because right now like they are like sharing kids on separate weekends hardcore.
Hello and welcome to Deep in the D-Pad, where we explore all things video games from an intellectual lens. I'm one of your hosts, RK Taylor, and with me is...
your friendly neighborhood designer, Carlos.
And today, Carlos is going to give us an insider perspective on crunch.
Indeed.
As many of you know, crunch is a period where developers are obliged to work long hours in order to meet a deadline. But what is really in the sauce of the crunch? But first, let us begin with our D-Pad delights. Carlos, do you have a D-Pad delight for us today?
Yeah, I have a D-Pad delight brought to us by Xbox Game Pass for PC. It's on a title called The Gardens Between. This is a puzzle game starring two friends, and you're sort of playing through these like fantastical lands. It's almost like you're controlling a movie. Like you can move left and move right, and that sort of progresses the timeline of this like grand animation of these characters going through a level. But then you need to like affect little things in the environment. Anyway, one thing that like made me go like, oh, this is amazing, like that really delighted me, was a computer puzzle towards the end of the game. While you're scrubbing along through the level, you get to a point where your characters are almost playing hopscotch across like a keyboard. I found that to be really funny, and I was sort of reversing. I was like going back and forth to make them like bounce on things over and over, and I thought it was cute. And when you get later in the level, you actually realize that those button presses, well, when you provide power to the computer...
Wait, hold on really quick. I just want anybody who's listening to this who hasn't played this, like, be aware that this is going to involve spoilers, and my response is definitely going to involve the, like, final scene of the game. So you may want to fast forward to the, like, deeper into the D-Pad segment if you don't want to hear some serious spoilers. But I know where you're going with this, Liz. You're going to talk about, like, the code. Like, it reveals a code when you're, like, stepping on the keyboard, right? Yeah, I love that puzzle.
Yeah. It's so good. And in the future, we will try to keep spoilers to a minimum on the D-Pad delights. But yeah, this puzzle was just so good, and this game was very good too. But when you are reversing time and forwarding time, like making the characters press these different buttons in a certain sequence in order to like activate different functions of the map, was just like such a fun revelation, such a delightful revelation, if you will. And that is my D-Pad delight for this week. I
completely agree with you. I found that to be like really fun. I love games where like movement is linked with time. What I was going to say about this game is that I don't think we've talked about this game ever, but like that game made me cry in the final scene. And for anybody who's interested who hasn't played, essentially you're going through these like diorama like levels, just as Carlos described, and you know, like you're moving time as you with each step, but you don't really know what they are, you know, and like they're kind of like maybe like surrealist might be the right word, and it's just there might be like, you know, I think on one level there was like an SNES that was like stuck in the side of a mountain or something like that, and you know, there's a slide at one point, and at the end you realize that it's like the two children that you're like playing as throughout the game they're like neighbors, and one of them is leaving, and the gardens between is like the playground between their two houses, and that is like you see the objects that you saw in the levels, and it like I was so emotionally struck by that, and you don't find out until the final scene. What did you think of that?
I thought that moment and just the like overall revelation was like just really nice, like really wholesome, but just so sad too, because it definitely brought up memories of just like different times where I've had to move, and like before social media, like just end up disconnecting with friends entirely and stuff like that. And that's where this game was coming from for sure. Like I felt the finality of like what these two kids shared like go away when the cars like drove off. And I think that's something that like really hits different. As much money as the big budget games make, they tend to tell a lot of like the same archetypal stories, I guess. And this one kind of didn't feel like that. Like I don't know how many big budget games I've seen where it just like ends off in this sort of Empire Strikes Back, but like intentionally so like these like this must happen. This is the sad ending, but this is growth. Like these people are going to grow and become their own individuals, and like the gardens between are the memories that they'll cherish. Like those are the various worlds that we got to travel. God, that was all just so great, so fucking touching.
Yeah, and it speaks to the power of like imagistic storytelling too. You know, I don't remember there being any like lines of dialogue or anything like that in the entire game.
Not a single line, no.
Yeah, and like the fact that we can both be so moved and find the game so touching just because of like the final shot. You know, it's like they captured so much, and it really just brings you back to play and imagination, and it's commenting on that part of us that as adults, you know, we're drawn to this game to engage in the same kind of like pretend and experience fun and joy in the same way that these kids are, and like as we've talked about, like the actual connection. You know, like you said before, social media moving was really hard, and like video games. You know, we live across the country from each other, but we can still play Rocket League and, you know, enjoy ourselves together. And yeah, I mean, it's a privilege to be able to be at this point in history where that is where we can avail ourselves of those kinds of like technologies for communication.
Yeah, indeed. For all the bad we see them do in the various headlines and in our own personal experiences, like the good things of technology and social media today is that it can allow for kids like this who build these gardens between and get separated to then have their basically the internet becomes their garden at that point, right? Because that's where they get to reconnect. That's where when they play video games, like that's a whole new like diorama set of memories they're building. Like imagine if you were playing through a level themed after Bug Snacks or Call of Duty Warzone or Fortnite. I think it's that. I think the new gardens between is like the internet or just however you connect with people. Like maybe that's actually the gardens between is like whatever platform you use to connect and build memories. I feel like there's got to be something related to Death Stranding in there. We can totally cut what I'm saying right now, but like I don't know. There's some synapse in my brain that's saying like this links. I got to think on that more.
I'm excited to tell you about my D-pad delight. So when we last talked, I think that you suggested that I play My Friend Pedro, and I have. And it's a really short game. It's only like 3 or 4 hours or something like that. I loved it. I loved the...
Yes.
This is a similar, like, for it's interesting because the game is, like, the least wholesome. Like, it's very, you know, in contrast to the most wholesome game that, like, I can think of.
Because your game is on, like, the total opposite side of the coin. Ryan, can you give, like, a nice, like, 1 to 3 sentence rundown of My Friend Pedro?
Okay. My Friend Pedro is a, like, side-scrolling shooter where you can... gosh, it's so hard. It's such a unique beast, honestly. You can dodge, you can slow down time, you can like do things like kick enemies, and they like die. Most of them die in like one hit, and like you can kick a frying pan and like shoot the frying pan, and bullets can ricochet. So there are a lot of different ways of killing enemies, and you kind of have to like just like blast through it. You know, the levels are intricately designed, and there's slight like puzzle elements to them, occasional puzzle elements, but it's mostly just like a shoot 'em up. And Pedro is a banana that you are friends with, which leads me to my D-pad delight. So again, this is going to have a spoiler, and like Carl said, we will try not to have so many spoilers, but this is like about the final scene of the game. So my girlfriend asked me what the deal was with the banana, because it's like this like kind of floating banana who is your friend, and it's like why is he here? And I was like, you know what, narratively it doesn't really make sense. Like in the first level there are like mobsters, and in the subsequent levels there are like hitmen or nerds. Something like that. Yeah,
hitmen, nerds, thugs of all kind.
Yes. But the banana didn't really fit into the story like very well, so I was like, you know what? I hadn't really thought about that. I thought it was just kind of like this absurdist touch that they threw in there. And then I was like, maybe it's a manifestation of his subconscious. Like maybe he is deranged, and like this is, you know, like what's like how it's manifesting in this like hallucination of a banana, which it still could be, I guess. But then I like beat the final boss, and then it was really the penultimate boss, because there is like a boss after, and that is Pedro. You have to like destroy the banana, and he gets like enormous and whatnot. But
Yeah.
so he's no longer the small banana who's been in your backpack the whole time. And it was just so funny to me that she was like, so what's the deal with the banana? And like there actually was a deal with the banana, and I just did not put two and two together, you know, that and like I just totally fell for that surprise and I loved it.
That's such a funny and astute observation. Because I think that's what everyone's going to ask at first, like, what's the deal with the banana? And most people will just think of it like Hattie from like Super Mario Odyssey. But yeah, like that game, like you said, like it takes so many wild turns, and then right at the end it feels like a wild last turn, but I think it could also be seen as predictable. But even so, it's a turn that I think we all want regardless. Like if you're watching like Pacific Rim or Godzilla, you're like, I know things are gonna fight at the end, we need to get to that part. And I think that's just what this is, right? And like, speaking of like cool absurdist parts, the whole sequence of levels where you're like have a propeller hat and you're using the dodge move to fly through the levels.
Yeah, that's
game
so
design
neat.
wise, I love it. I love this game so much because of just how like the pacing and like how much it stretches each of its ideas.
Yes, exactly. I could not believe how each level there was something new. And it could be as simple as like there's a skateboard, you know, or like there's a basketball and you can kick the basketball at someone's head. And like because almost everything is like a one-hit kill, you know, like you can crush someone with a barrel and it doesn't matter how fast the barrel is moving. It's like it just basically has to touch them and they die. And it's like satisfying because it's like you have to dodge well and then you have to touch each of these people. And then like there are screws, and when you dodge and you're spinning, you unscrew something which allows you to like access a new path or something, you know. And it's like, wow, they're really finding ways to continue to build on like what seems at first like a very basic idea, you know, like a very simple shoot 'em up, you know. And then they're like, you know, like you said, stretching each of these the component parts and, you know, finding new ways to use them. It's very fresh.
Yeah.
And now let's get deeper into the D-pad. Okay, so let me tell you what I know about Crunch, and then you can tell me where I'm wrong and enlighten me. Is that cool?
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, so when I think of Crunch, you know, I think about like IGN or other like, you know, news, like games news outlets publishing articles that are basically like, these developers of this studio have to work X amount of hours per week, and it's like always some number that's like above 40, and it's mandatory, and like is this a human rights violation? We don't know, you know. And it's like, what should you do about like the fact that this is happening? Basically just read this article, and like we don't have a solution because like game development is super new, and like nobody really thinks about like the like autonomy and the well-being of game developers, because we just need that product so badly, and like we're maniacs for it. And you know, it's like there's something about gaming specifically that's like so visceral, and you're so connected to it, that I think people have extremely high expectations for the product, and want to be like, no other industry. I mean, not to say that other people in the entertainment industry aren't working very hard, but I don't hear about movies or TV shows or writers or anything like that having crunch. So there's something unique about the video game industry in this, and this seems to be like a pretty widespread problem. So just as my like initial like glaze of what is crunch, do you have anything that you want to talk about specifically that you think people should know about? And also, have you crunched, and which games were you crunching for, if you are comfortable talking about that? And go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just start at the top. So you said that, well, this is funny because on a different episode you actually brought up a movie that had crunch, and that's Sonic the Hedgehog. So what I wanted to bring up is like,
which is based on a game.
Exactly, right? A lot of these tech industries have crunch currently. Like if you like talk to somebody who works on like special effects, they'll probably have worked crunch on like a movie or like a trailer or some sort of project. If you talk to actual like programmers of a website, like they may have crunched on something. I don't personally know how much it pops up for them. I think in the movie industry it pops up more so, and movies and games I think are the ones, at least in my mind, that have crunch pop up quite often. I think in an earlier conversation you said that crunch came at the tail end of a project cycle, like towards the launch of a game, and that's not necessarily true. Crunch can actually happen at like any point. Nightmarishly enough, like if you have a bad production team or a bad management team, they'll crunch you like like during pre-production or during like the first stage of production on a game before. Oh, first stage of production being getting a like first playable, like just simply making a prototype. You don't want to be spending like 50 to 60 hours a week just making a prototype that you want it to, accomplish its goal, but you don't want to be overworking yourself just to make something that is like vaguely reminiscent of what the final product is going to be. Like you want to actually just work a regular amount of hours and stuff like that. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious about that. So if for people who are crunched at the beginning of the development cycle, are they also going to be crunching more likely than not? Are they going to be crunching at the end of it as well? Or is it just the beginning and then they're not crunching for a few months or something like that?
So that all depends on management and their own deadlines. So if you had a studio that agreed to make like a big open world game in a year, they would be crunching every single second of that game's development because the timeline is just too unrealistic. If you had a team, and again, this is like a lot of it is scheduling and planning. So if you had a team that said, hey, we need 2 years to make My Friend Pedro, I believe in my own like experience, or given my own experience, I believe that 2 years to make My Friend Pedro would give you more than enough time to work regular 40-hour weeks and still have a very nice like clean product at the end. But you could at the same time have that scenario and have a project planning team that is like, we need to get everything done aggressively as soon as possible, and they end up like taking this like wide 2 years and crunching it down to like, let's get it done in 1 year or 8 months, that way we can use all that extra 2 year time for like polishing. And what you end up getting is a very shit core product that was made in 8 months, and then you're trying to polish that turd product for 2 years. 12 months.
Okay, so is it more likely to happen? Okay, I guess I have a couple questions. And like already, thank you for like clarifying some of the misunderstanding that I've had about crunch. Is it the case that everybody on the development team will crunch usually, or is it the case? I understand that like this is like dependent on each of the developers and all of that. But so like broad strokes here, is it the case that like most of the time when a studio is crunching, that every single member will crunch, or is it the case that like only specific teams, like it's like, well, we need the animators to be crunching?
Right. Yeah. Totally. So I've actually gone through multiple types of crunching when it comes to this, like team crunching. For various reasons, I'm not gonna state specific projects or whatever. But on one project I was crunching on, we had like maybe 2 to 3 crunch periods where the entire studio needed to stay for like X number of hours. And this felt good at first because I was able to access the people that I really needed at those times where I was like getting stuff together. But then that quickly became like a sword in the side, because when I didn't really have anything left to do and I was just sort of like on standby, I was getting understandably frustrated. Like, and so basically, like when everybody on the team is being asked to crunch, like to spend the same exact hours, people get annoyed because every individual does not have the same amount of importance at every given moment. So like a VFX artist doesn't need to stay until 8 just because like we don't have the levels fully fleshed out. So what happened later in that project when we as the team gave feedback to the producers and upper management that like this was really annoying us and hurting our like quality of life, because so many of these people are like older than me, they have multiple kids, they have wives, they have like other family situations, and they're just being like kept home for seemingly no reason but, hey, we may need you, so please just hang around. And it's like, well, I need to pick up my kid from hockey and I need to cook dinner for the family or something like that. So anyway, the other type, the type we moved to, was more of a like rotating, almost like departmental style crunch. And that was like, okay, well, this group of engineers, like, you stay a couple of hours for this week because there are people who need you, and then this group of artists, like, you're going to stay this week, that type of thing. And that evolved into what I think is the best method so far, which was strike team crunching. Strike team being you gather a group of developers all related to one piece of content, and then you have them work together and communicate together as like a strike team to accomplish this one part of the game. And that could, for example, that could be like body armor on enemies. This is kind of like a micro thing. Like, it would probably be like, oh, this heavy enemy with body armor, that particular piece of content is going to be owned by like a combat designer, a combat engineer, like this sound design guy, and like this VFX artist, and then all 4 or 5 of you are going to just work together on making this one guy feel really good in the game. That's a strike team. And so towards the end of one of my projects, we started doing strike team crunch, and that felt great because I had the good side of like, everyone I need is available to me, even though it's kind of late. And I guess sort of because I'm on the design end, most of the time I was at the tail end of the pipe. So like when I got everything in, then it was like done, and it needed to be reviewed by like the director. So I would end up staying quite late. And because my things relied on someone else, I would have to stay as late as somebody else. So as a designer, you kind of can't escape being the end of the road for a lot of content.
Right. Okay. I'm like really excited with how much I'm already learning about this, and I just have more questions that keep popping up. One of the ones that has been on the back burner is I would guess that crunch is more likely to come from like AAA studios because there's like higher demand. But is that true? Is that the case? Do indie studios have fewer people usually, so perhaps they are more likely to crunch because they don't have the staff that they need? So what's the situation?
You're right on the money with that last part. That's exactly what I was gonna say. Had you had stopped any sooner, indie studios, I don't think they're just as susceptible to crunch, but they can very easily stumble themselves into crunch, or actually worse so, willingly overwork themselves. Like basically their passion will flare up too much, and this has happened to me in the past with games or other things. But you're just like, oh, I absolutely love this game I'm working on. Me and 4 dudes are working on it. Like, it's just so fun. It's amazing. Ooh, here's a little thing I can add. And you keep doing that. Here's a little thing. This is so fun. Let me spend another hour. And even though you're having fun, your body and your mind is still taking the brunt of that force. So an indie can definitely like overwork themselves into oblivion. And there was one game recently that is on like the tip of my tongue that I can't quite remember, that they had mentioned like crunching on it, even though they were an indie game. It was just a couple people, like they had self-imposed. Maybe it was like a Mark Brown video, Game Maker Toolkit. But yeah, basically, to answer your question, I think AAAs are more likely to crunch, or at least we're way more likely to find out about them crunching, whereas indies, because they're less staffed, like they definitely have to work more, or at least do like a wider variety of work, but they can avoid the crunching as long as they spec out their game well, meaning like, we're only a team of 6 people, we think we can accomplish a game of a small scope within like 12 to 18 months, something like that, rather than maybe doing what a Senua's Sacrifice is, where it's like, let's take a kind of indie sized, I don't know if it was an indie sized team per se, but like, let's take a smaller team and try to make this like AAA looking game. I think that's something that Days Gone actually like went through a lot of growing pains with, because it was a small studio before Days Gone. Like, they had been working on PS Vita games for a while, and they had to size up from I think when I joined the Sony Bend team, they were like 50 or 60 people, and by the time Days Gone was done, which was like 4 years after I had joined, they were at about 125 plus people. And we desperately needed all of those people, as well as like we could have used quite a few more. But you see other games like Ubisoft games, typically having like 200 to 300 people working on it. They're these massive open world games, and like, they have much bigger checklists, so they have to support all that by hiring on more people, but at the same time, making all that content is probably going to demand like more hours. So it's just this big matter of like spinning plates and making sure you can like estimate how long each plate is going to spin. So yeah, big part of my job as I move like from like entry to mid-level to senior is more and more like absolutely understand like how long it's going to take for you to do this, or for someone, depending on what your career path is, like understanding how long it takes for you to do things and for other people, various disciplines, to accomplish tasks.
It sounds like you're suggesting that crunch can be either like a formal or an informal process. So like when you were saying like indie developers may just like have a lot of passion and they may be crunching, even if they're not calling it crunching, they could still be getting like burnt out. Like in the social work field, we talk about burnout a lot, right? Like people who overextend themselves, or maybe they don't turn their phone off if they're like on call. Maybe they're checking their phone all the time, or they get like really tough cases. I think part of it is like setting boundaries for yourself and those kinds of things. But it sounds like crunch is almost like, the closest parallel that I have to that. And if you can have an employer who's like forcing you to work a bunch of hours, or you can just like, voluntarily do that and like really like check in with your people.
Like I've seen both, I've experienced both. Like I've had pieces of content that I have worked on that are like I'll be working on it and then see like a place for improvement, or get some sort of spark of an idea by talking with like, say, a combat designer or an artist, somebody else on the team that's working on my content. That makes me go, oh, let me just spend an extra like hour or two here today and see if I can actually like rough this in and see what it feels like. And that's more of the volunteer style, like passion based. I wouldn't even call it crunch, right? Because crunch to me is not simply working extra hours, but it's working extra hours for like a prolonged period of time, which I probably should have led with earlier in this show. But simply like,
so for weeks.
Yeah, I would say definitely like weeks is when you go into crunch. If you're going like over 40 hours, over 40 hours at all, like that is a heavy work week. But I wouldn't call it crunch until you do maybe like 2 of those weeks back to back, or like 3 of those weeks back to back. Certainly 2, actually. I would just start it at 2.
So like 50 hours back to back?
Yeah, exactly. 45 hours like for 2 weeks back to back would be like super light crunch. 50 hours would be like light crunch, that type of thing.
And what's the most egregious crunch you've ever heard?
I've ever heard? I've read about Fable 1 on the original Xbox having like 60 to 80 hour work weeks put on their devs involuntarily for over 8 months straight.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
60-hour minimum? Oh my gosh, dude.
60 to 80, yeah, quite fucked. I don't know if I personally would have been able to survive that game, because that sounds insane. And my experience with crunch has like made me really not ever want to go through that again. So I don't know.
Does like management like say we're going to go into a period of crunch, or do they say something like we're mandating 60-hour work weeks? Like how formal is that term? Is that just like something that like, is it a slang term?
Okay, in most of my experience, no studio has been like, yeah, we're gonna crunch and everybody needs to crunch like now. Like that, they don't say it like that. I mean, it happens like that, like I explained earlier in this episode, but nobody ever says it like that, which like which is one of my various biggest pet peeves with the games industry. In my experience, like it has come up in the sense of like during a meeting, somebody will say, hey guys, so we got like a lot of we got a lot of work and we got this deadline to meet, so these are the things like we need to accomplish. And I feel being a kind of like somewhat naive, like out of college kid, like had the audacity to ask like, okay, so how many extra hours do you want us to work this week, like during the meeting. And I got a very weird look I got a very weird look, and the answer was like kind of a meandering like, we're not demanding you work any extra hours this week, but we're just asking you to like get these accomplished by like the deadline. And it's like, well, it's very clear we don't have enough time within like the 40 hours to get this done, so like what, like, do you want me to put in an extra 2 a day or some extra 1 a day? And basically like it rolled into the answer being like, hey dude, like if you can get the work done really quick to like a good quality and you don't have to crunch, then don't crunch, even though that wasn't fucking true. Or basically like, if you want to work regular hours, go ahead and work regular hours, but what you're responsible for is not going to get done at the quality bar we expect within the time frame. Therefore, you will prove to be a detriment to our team. Therefore, we'll probably have to, this is again like when I'm saying therefore and kind of rolling this on, like this is the silently like
it's implied and subtle.
Yeah, the gears working in your head as to like, oh well, what happens if I decide to just work regular hours, right? It's not like, oh, you're disobeying an order from the company. It's like, well, if you're not working as much as everyone else in that moment, then your content is not coming up to a quality bar that like the rest of the teams. And so basically it's like, hey, the schedule is like demanding all the team members do this thing, and if you aren't going to adhere to the schedule, then obviously you're like hurting our end package. Very, very weird, like shitty scenario. But I can understand from like a logistics standpoint, you can't just say like, hey Tommy, work 3 extra hours like every day this week, and your level is gonna be like really fucking good. Because he could be playing like solitaire for like 90 minutes of those 3 hours every day, and or he could be working those full 3 hours and his content still doesn't get up to snuff. There are just some people out there who unfortunately like can't make the content, so you could run into that situation. Or rather, they can make the content but they can't get it to a high enough quality bar for that deadline. I'm not sure.
What about compensation? Do most studios have a kind of like overtime policy where it's like, is that what it's called, overtime?
Any studio you work at, like business-wise, it'll just be called overtime. Internally, they can call it crunch or whatever they want, but it is business-wise called overtime because you are working past your 40-hour work week. And so to answer your question about the compensation when you do work beyond that 40-hour work week, in my experience, and as far as I know, only hourly employees really get that compensation. Salaried employees do not get paid extra for working longer hours. They may gain other benefits like profit sharing. At a AAA level, there's profit sharing, which means when a big title comes out, if you're part of the salaried core team that works on it, as long as you're still salaried and working at that studio that released the game, you will receive like these bonus checks essentially, like past the launch of the game,
like royalties.
Yeah, basically like basically like royalties, which is really cool. So like you and the rest of the studio get like some percentage of cut off from like the overall sales of like that title. So like some of my friends who still work at Sony Bend, who I've spoken to recently, they actually told me about some of the because I've never personally experienced it, they have like enlightened me on the profit sharing experience and like what it's like. And it's totally like you just receive a check in the mail and it's like, oh cool, Skylanders or whatever, and you get a couple bucks or whatever. Although it's definitely more than a couple bucks, but it's not like millionaire money by any means.
That seems like a great system. It's almost like you're getting commission, and if you did a great job with the game and people love the game, and I mean, you're not, it's out of your hands to some extent, like how well the game is received by But I don't know, I like the proportionality there. Not to say that I'm in favor of crunch or anything, but I do like that as like a method of compensation, in a like theoretically.
Yeah, me too. I enjoy the I like the idea of profit sharing. I hope I can enjoy that benefit in the future. Um, the profit sharing, like being able to have actual shares of the company, I know that's a thing with like traded companies like Activision Blizzard. I think when you become salaried, you get like some portion of shares, and a lot of other tech places do that. Like I think maybe like Google and or Facebook do something to that effect. But the overall compensation for the crunch time, like I don't know if it's there because again for the salaried people, like you may get milestone bonuses. I don't know how much those usually are, and you will get the end of the game royalties, which aren't guaranteed by any means. But if you guys break even and then continue to make profits, you will see some of those profits, which is nice. Depending on the project and then time, that's how I know or not like if it makes up for it, right? Because if you're salaried and you go through a nightmare project where it just like almost like physically kills you from how much like work you've done, then like seemingly no amount of checks, outside of like a couple $1 million or something is going to really make you say like, oh, that was worth it.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. And going back to like originally, I was like, this happens to the games industry almost exclusively, and you were like, no, it happens to people in the movies industry too, in certain parts of it. Like the effects workers and things like that. And I realized, you brought up like Google and tech companies and things like that. And I also believe that I don't know if they continue to have problems with crunch, but I know that they have in the past. And you and I have talked about how like, like these Silicon Valley companies will have like an incredibly elaborate like office with like a slide and like all the snacks you could possibly ever want and sleep pods and like just they like a luxury workspace as a way to almost like try to lure you in and entice you to work here and to like almost be like less resentful of the fact that you're going to be spending maybe 80 hours a week there or something like that. And that's like an alternative form of compensation. I don't know what it's like inside of a studio. I'm wondering if game studios are similar since they're like tech companies, or if they don't have the money for those kinds of resources. Is there anything about like the actual space that is enticing to you? Do they let you play video games on the clock? What are the other selling points that like they try to use as like bargaining chips?
Yeah, so it depends on I guess kind of the age of the studio or the company. Like what you're mentioning with the slides and like sushi every Wednesday, or like unlimited candy machines around, those are like a lot of sort of startup things, or rather maybe I should call them startup traps. Just a lot of like Willy Wonka chocolate factory / Pinocchio's like Pleasure Island type gotchas to pull you in, without you realizing like these are all things to replace parts of your home within the workplace. So we will see things like you may have a like beer fridge. This is kind of big in Montreal, but like having a beer fridge to enjoy like one beer in the afternoon with coworkers. There will be snack fridges that are like fully stocked with like either junk food and or health food. We'll see like during my time working on Days Gone, I keep bringing that up because like that the studio actually changed buildings because it had grown so much. So I kind of got to see the two sides of the coin, like going from a smaller to a bigger thing. But basically, like on the old Sony Bend building, we would have like two vending machines. We could put in we could put in a little bit of money, less than like you normally would, I don't know what Sony hooked up there, but it was kind of like a cheaper vending machine that you could get cool snacks from, and we even had one that had ice cream in it, and I was like, oh, neat. Then you jump cut to, when we're working a couple of extra hours, and it's like, oh, well, I guess I'm gonna get an ice cream sandwich, and like that feels good at the time, but like a couple weeks later, you've realized you've eaten too many ice cream sandwiches, and like you hate yourself for working too much and eating too many ice cream sandwiches.
What about like showers and lockers and things like that? Like, do they have like amenities that are like quality of life things that are not just like kind of like sweet treats to?
Yeah, I was actually just about to jump on that. So like outside of the slides and the ball pits and the weird stuff, like having like showers in the bathrooms having a shower room, a showers in the bathroom is usually seen as a pro, which I mean it is, but it is also, you got to keep in the back of your mind, like this is so that I can shower in case I am working too long, or basically in case I'm working long enough or in such a way that I'm getting funky around the office, which is like something like you don't want happening anyway. But it's never highlighted that way. It's always like, hey, do you enjoy working out? Like you can go work out on your lunch break and then just come here, shower, dress, boom, you're like back to work, you got your workout, you feel great. And so I think with like a lot of this stuff, you can just look at it either with like an optimistic or a cynical eye. So like outside of the shower room, like I mentioned with working out, they could even have the workout place on site. Like right. Like the studio I'm at currently, we have. And this is not to say that they have all these things because they're crunching us and stuff. Like this is just what they have, and I enjoy these features of the studio. But they have like a little weight room. We have showers. We have a full snack pantry, like literally like going to your friend's house, the one who has the fucking walk-in snack pantry. That's what we have at my studio, and you know exactly who I'm talking about. So yeah, all of that, and we even have a kitchen that like has we have a kitchen that we can use like full like I think there's like a hot plate or something, so like you can cook a little something there if you need to.
All free, right? All of this is
all
like
free,
okay.
all free because you work there. There's even like they even stock the fridge with like milk like the things you could add on to your bagels or your cereal and stuff. And obviously coffee's available. All this shit is there for you.
What about a place to sleep? Is there a place to sleep?
No. Okay, so caveat on that, I say no, there is no dedicated sleep room in my experience that I have like witnessed at any studio. There is no dedicated, this room is like where you should sleep or this is where you should sleep. There are some studios that will have furniture around its floors, and these at times may be used for sleep, but again, these are more oftentimes meeting rooms that happen to have a couch in it, like not an actual like sleeping room. I think like crunch is a little less common than it was before, and I think, year after year with all these articles we see coming out, we have more and more movement behind making crunch as infrequent as possible, because like on the business side of things, like I would say like maybe smarter and or like fresher business folk are like, hey, I don't want to destroy my workforce because I need them to help make me money. So if your workforce is a group of game developers, you don't necessarily want to be burning them out and then spending more money hiring new guys and wasting time trying to train those guys to get them to the same level that your previous guys were before you burnt them out.
Have you known anybody who's left the game industry because like they couldn't take the work conditions?
Not because they couldn't take the work conditions. They definitely could take the work conditions. They did take the work conditions. And I don't know if they decided to come back. I just know they haven't worked on games since they have left, but like the work they were doing it wasn't satisfying, on top of having to spend so much time working. On top of that particular individual, on top of having to spend so much extra time working, what they were working on stuff that they didn't even really care about. Like it was kind of like the shit that nobody else wanted to do, unfortunately. Now I know they work on things. Maybe I don't not necessarily like getting paid wise, but at least in their spare time, they're working on shit that they really love. And I'm so happy they're doing that.
Yeah, it reminds me of like one of the previous episodes you were talking about, like there's someone who spent like weeks or months creating the testicles on a horse in Red Dead that like so that they shrink when they get cold and stuff. And it's like, who became a game developer so that they could work on the horse balls? Like, it's just,
I don't think I brought this up when I was talking about the hourly work, but hourly workers are contractual. You don't have people who are like actually like directly part of the studio on an hourly pay rate. There we go. Yes. In recent years, I've seen kind of like a sort of weird hybrid where it's like, hey, you are actually like under the umbrella of the first party studio, but you're still being paid hourly. So you're kind of like in this sort of gray area in between. Contractual workers are typically like, hey, we're going to try you out for 6 months or 9 months, whatever. And if you adapt to the team, then we'll either extend your contract, we'll put you into this like more connected contract, or we'll like make you salaried. And I think in both the contract area and the gray area, actually probably with all areas, you could just be fired at any point. I'm pretty sure there's just always like written terminology in these contracts for at least my profession that's like, hey, if we want to fire you at any point, we totally can. And anything you have thought about and put to actual like put into the universe while you were like with us is like under our control.
Yeah, this is okay. So I in a moment I want to turn to like kind of the moral ramifications, or perhaps maybe your moral intuitions on crunch, and if there was going to be like kind of like a reform movement that you could start, or if you could just like snap your fingers and change things. I would like to hear your thoughts about those. But first, I want to hear a little bit more about like why crunch happens. So I'm wondering if it's because of like understaffing, or if like is it like just quite common for management to not have an accurate a prediction for how long it's going to take and like what the resources are going to be, and then suddenly you're like swept away. And obviously there are pressures about like, you know, if you state the release date of a game and then you realize that you're not making that, like, you know, if things are taking longer than expected, then you may, you know, want to stay true to that because you don't want fans to be upset with you.
Crunch happens because, at least on the planning board, it appears that a deadline won't be able to be met. Meaning, let's say like alpha is your sort of vertical slice first playable. If your planning team says, hey, we're going to take 2 months to make our first playable, here we're going to give a week to everything, go ahead and like work. That could be totally fine and not be like a crunch process. Then out of nowhere, like somebody like gets sick or breaks their leg, or basically somebody can't work for a week, and now that offsets the plan, and then that makes the deadline like now start to like slip away. That's one way crunch can happen. The other way, which I mentioned earlier in the episode, is that the planning can basically miscalculate how much time it takes to do various tasks, and thus it will make people be working harder and or faster to accomplish these things, or more, actually, not even harder and faster, but actually just working more hours in order to accomplish their goal. Besides the product scheduling and the like deadline slipping thing, feature creep is something that could trigger crunch. Feature creep is when you're basically just keep on adding in like, and this thing to your game, which bloats the project incredibly. Like, any individual feature is going to have exponential amounts of work to make sure that feature is like up to par with everything else in the game. You can't just say like, hey, let's add a punch, because what you're saying is, hey, let's add in a punch animation, a punch sound effect, a like punch VFX. We need the AI to be able to punch and like recognize when punch is happening, and on and on and on. So yeah, like that, I would say those are like kind of the three big ways crunch can happen. If you're just trying to get like a quick knowledge tidbit, it would be those three ways.
Feature creep is a great term. I really like that concept. So turning to the moral weight of crunch. I imagine that we'll have some similar intuitions about the moral weight of crunch. It just seems like wrong, it seems wrong that people who are people get into the video game industry because they're passionate about video games, and then the thing that they're passionate about, it kind of gets run into the ground, and they're not necessarily forced, but it seems coercive. It seems like there's the fact that someone could lose their job at any moment is not quite a threat, but it's I think for most people with their jobs, they know that they have to work what they agreed to at the beginning. So if you're working a full-time job, you work 40 hours a week, you do what you need to do. And there are no conditions that are going to radically change your 40-hour work week. So I think this field is uncommon in that there's kind of variability in how many hours it requires its employees to work. And it feels coercive to me. I know that if I went to work for 20 hours a week instead of 40, I could get fired, but it's because I agreed to 40 when I signed the contract. But because it's flexible for you, for folks in your position, right? It seems like they have a lot of leverage there that they really shouldn't have. And, we could get into the whole Marxist idea here, if you want to. Where do you want to go with this? What are your thoughts?
Right. So I guess for our listeners, just really quick, the reason we bring up the Marxist thing is the idea that the developers of the game are the workers, and the bourgeoisie or whatever, the rich people are the ones who are at the top, making these plans. So if we kind of bring it into more recent events, the proletariat, the developers would be the CD Projekt Red, the people who put together Cyberpunk 2077, whereas their bosses, the board and whoever else set these schedules would be the bourgeois.
Right, the CEO, the CEO who's going to be raking in the profits of this game. I'm sorry, what were the thing that I was calling royalties? What did you call those for that the developers get a cut?
Profit sharing checks.
Profit sharing. That must be, for the individual workers, that must be a fraction of a percent. I
absolutely.
cannot imagine how small that is.
Absolutely. If any of our listeners look up Bobby Kotick, they will see just how little that they can get an idea. If you look up Bobby Kotick and various articles about him, you can get just a vague but really good idea as to how much more money the CEOs get for all the work that hundreds upon hundreds of people do for hundreds of thousands of hours just on one game.
Yeah, and the other aspect that's the other Marxist lens that I could apply to this is Marxist alienation. I don't know if we've talked about this before on the show, but
this concept's new to me.
It sounds new?
It sounds new to me, yes.
Yeah, so it's the idea that workers are divorced from the products that they're creating, right? So again, people who go into this industry are going to it because they believe that they can have a creative contribution in the video game field, but someone's going to be working on the horse testicles. Someone is going to be designing the darts minigame, and when they may want to be working on the shooting or the driving or something else, and not everybody can do the things that it's not the interests that the developers have are going to be distributed across every single task. Someone is going to get stuck doing the things that nobody else wants to do because it's not boring or not challenging. And then not only are you forced to work these long hours, but you're also divorced from the product, meaning you don't have a sense of purpose doing it. It doesn't feel valuable to you to do this, even though you know that it needs to get done. Just as if someone is in a factory and they're making let's say they're making shoes in a factory. I don't even know if that's possible. I have no idea how shoes are made, but let's say they're pressing a button, right? If even if they are really passionate about shoes, the factory work is probably not a fulfilling way of going about experiencing or finding that fulfillment. Perhaps they want to be designing shoes or doing something that involves creativity, or working with testing whether or not they feel comfortable or something like that. There are other ways to maximize the appreciation. So there's always going to be this problem when you have hundreds of people on a team. Some people are not going to be able to do the job that they want, and most people are not going to be able to have the say that they want, because
Yeah.
you're beholden to, especially if it's like a franchise or something like that, you're beholden to the ideas of whoever's in charge, and so you're kind of, you become these like worker bees.
Yeah, and it doesn't happen all too often. It absolutely does happen, like you said, like somebody gets stuck working on the content that, or the functionality that nobody else wants to work on. But a bigger piece too is that, especially in a larger game, you are so clearly a cog in a bigger machine, and it's definitely made clear at various points that well, with the games industry, I think it's kind of been sort of instilled at some sort of like societal level that, like, you know, that anyone working in that industry should feel super lucky and appreciative that they're in that industry, because there are so many new people that could just as easily replace them, and that lends itself to the cog in the machine feeling. And if you're working on a big like 300-hour game like Assassin's Creed, but you personally are only working on like 15 missions in a game that has like 300 missions, like how much pride can you take in that game? How much pride can you take in your own work? Like me personally, I can take pride in the contributions I have made, like making full length missions, X number of missions for like a big game. I can take pride in those contributions, but like how much can I say that the game itself is actually like my game, I guess.
Right. It's like if you're working on Henry Ford's assembly line, and like you are putting like a nut on a tire for in the Model T. I don't know if they had nuts on the on tires back then, or like what that situation was, but you didn't build the car. You know, you just put a lot of nuts on 100 cars, and like that may create cars like way more quickly, but it's harder to value your contribution because you're kind of this like anonymous like hive worker, you know. I mean, it's just like a bunch of people doing this thing, and like there were other nuts that need to get put on. You might be jealous of someone who got to put on the mirror, or, you know, the windshield or whatever. Like
that's kind of like the best analogy for modern AAA development, I feel.
Assembly line
is just that Model T assembly line. Not saying like all AAA games are exactly the same, but in terms of like how they're made, they have certainly like boiled it down to a science, which I think is good. Like, we want to know how to make games like well, but we want to take that framework and improve upon it. And I guess that framework right now is just a little too much like that assembly line.
Right. So you know, like, I guess like the next part of the moral question would be, you know, how do we respect the rights of workers, right? How do we, and we found ways to do that in other places where workers were marginalized, like unions, for example. Do you have any like ideas about this, or like any hopes for the future of the like developer industry, ways that like either crunch could be enacted more morally, or, I mean, ideally I think the planning would just be better and we could like obviate the need to crunch in the first place. But that also seems almost utopian in a way, because clearly nobody wants to crunch, and it's like, but it's still so common. So what are your thoughts on like how to make it either more moral, or to prevent it from, you know, preclude the need of crunching?
Yeah, so yeah, I agree that no crunch is certainly a utopian idea. That being said, I don't think it's impossible. I think it was like, I think I had seen earlier, maybe on a Jim Sterling video, that like Hades actually like didn't have any crunch, because they had used early access and continued working regular hours while staying in touch with their community and obviously making a good product, which led to them making a fuckload of money because they made a good product, they did their work. But getting back to your question, are there ways that studios can enact crunch in a moral manner? Let's take crunch, and something I probably could have touched on way earlier is that like the various lengths of crunch create different crunches themselves. So like I stated earlier, like crunch will be defined as like at least 2 weeks of like longer work hours, right? But really that could really like a 2 week longer work hour thing is just a sprint, whereas doing that for a month is like whereas doing that for a month is like crunching. Doing that for longer than a month is certainly like crunch. And then the worst point is when you hit the death march, which is either we are going to crunch from now until the game launches, or we are going to crunch from now until somebody says we don't need the crunch, which is probably scarier than the first option.
Yeah, it also reminds me of the strike team thing that you were talking about. Like, there are different ways. Like, it could be the entire studio, it could be, you know, like specific people, like etc. And like really just like, I guess the developers having or like the management having an idea of who is most necessary, rather than having just kind of like a blanket mandate, seems like it would be more considerate as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I would say the most moral, or the best, the most preferred crunch that I was a part of was the strike team crunch, because again, I had access to everyone I needed. Those people needed access to me, so they got it. Because we were available together, let's say half the time we didn't necessarily need to stay super, super late. But also because not everybody else was at the studio, like glaring at each other for having to be there, it softened a little bit the feeling of like, oh, other people are still here, like I should still be around. Like that feeling was still there for sure, because if you see anyone at work when you're going to leave, at least if you're kind of like me in my field, you're gonna feel like, oh, maybe I could be doing some part to help so that they don't have to be here longer. But that's simply not the case. Like, some people just need to work on their stuff. So the most moral version would be that strike team thing, and basically trying to have that as like short term as possible. I've been a part of more strike team concerted like efforts of like, hey, okay, we really don't want to do crunch. Like, so the planning team will say, we're just going to work for this 2 weeks. It's going to be a sprint. You guys are not to work beyond 50 hours. Like, we are only allowing you to work up to that much. Get your shit done within that time, and, you know, see how it goes from there. So far, I think that's the best way to do things if you can't avoid crunch entirely.
Yeah.
And one thing I wanted to touch on with unions, because this is something I haven't talked a lot about, but it's an idea that I, as well as a lot of developers, have been thinking on. And the kind of takes I've seen in regards to unions and crunch time is like people saying unions will be able to completely like get rid of crunch time. But then the opposite side of the coin being, well, if we completely get rid of crunch time and do indeed like hit a point where like Murphy's Law kicked in and we can't hit our deadline even though we're all working the appropriate amount of time and doing the right amount of work, like what happens? Again, like going to your example of when you announce your release date, that's when things start to get really tense, because you now have committed to like the world that like something's going to be there on this day, and it needs to be done long before that day for it to actually like get pressed to disk and be there. So unionization, I think, would be an overall good. And there's just a lot of, much like I think industries in the past, there's a lot of like talk on both sides, obviously, to make cases, but also that insidious like propaganda aspect that's like trying to, you know, keep unions apart. And so what is hard for developers, I guess, is to have like, maybe both for developers and the business side of things, is to have like that holistic view of the situation. Because I think from the actual like in the trenches like software content creators, like they would feel most strongly like, yeah, absolutely, like let's lock it in at like this number of hours. Whereas the people at the top are thinking, you know, but we have like legally made these agreements and we need to like hit these points. Let's say they're like the best business person and like they don't want to crunch their people, but they're still saying like, hey, we have a deadline we have to agree to, so we need to create some sort of like safety net or understood action that we can take if we are not able to hit that timetable. Like if all of the world decided, hey, video games should be made with only 40-hour work weeks, and then we got to a point where Cyberpunk was like, hey, we can't hit this, like we just weren't able to make the technological breakthroughs as fast, like we're gonna need extra time, like, and we don't want to give you guys a bad product. This is what our union says. We are allowed an extension of like X amount of time, and then like the game has to come out or something. I don't know. I'm kind of like theory crafting like things now, but that's it. That's sort of what those are the takes I've seen, and that's kind of like what I'm imagining, at least realistically, for unions at the moment.
Right. It almost sounds, I think it sounds like you're a little ambivalent about crunch because you recognize its utility. And so you don't want to just like strike crunch completely. You recognize that there are times where it might be necessary, and if it was done in a way that was conscious of the developers and things like that, like it's not like you're like crunch never. You're like crunch, yeah, I mean, I get why it has to happen. There are deals being made. There's a lot of money going on over here, and
crunch as like last case scenario is really what I'm advocating for. Is like last case scenario, we should be crunching. Like otherwise it should all go according to plan, and crunching should not be long. Like we've said crunch so many times in this episode. If anyone's playing a drinking game, you're dead by now. But like, when we say crunch, we're not talking about the fable like 60 hours a week for 8 months. Like that is absolutely unacceptable. What we are talking about is, again, that like short burst, like 2-week sprint style thing.
Okay. So that's really like the only justification for crunch. It's like almost like extra credit, where it's like, you know, like if a student like it has an F in a class, and then they just do a ridiculous amount of extra credit and they get an A. It's like,
that's very much what it is. Yeah.
This isn't how extra credit's supposed to work. This is just supposed to get you from like a B+ to an A- or something like that, you know, like chill, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And at times I have felt like major frustration because it had seemed like I ended up in a crunch like scenario because people had waited till like the last day to do their project, essentially. And I don't have the omnipresent view that like lets me know if that's actually the case. But definitely when it comes to crunching, I think there's a fair number of people out there in the industry that like get their things done later rather than sooner. And like, it is what it is.
Okay, so you know, you've talked a bit about unionization and like what that path forward might look like and some of the difficulties. I'm wondering if there are things that you think that consumers can do. So I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is like boycotting. If the people who purchased the game made a collective decision that they would not buy any games that involve where the studio's crunched, then developers would, you know, almost immediately stop crunching. Or at least they would find a way to, you know, conceal the fact that they're crunching or something like that, because they would really feel it in their pocket. I don't see that actually happening. I don't think that we can get enough people rallying around that. A lot of gamers have demonstrated that they don't value the lives of developers, you know, anyway, or they don't think about like, you know, how the sausage is made. But theoretically, it seems like boycotting could be something that could work. You know, it'd be that unions are the collective action of the workers, and the boycott would be collective action of the consumers. Do you have any other like ideas of what consumers can do that might make the situation a little bit more tolerable, or do you kind of feel like they're powerless, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a tough one, isn't it? Because I think that question can extend to like so many more things outside of just video games, right? Like let's take like Nike or any of these other like clothing brands that get outed for using sweatshops in Indonesia or wherever else. Like, what can people do to, or even Apple, right? I think Apple got into some hot water because they were using some like Foxconn shit to put their stuff together. But like, what can we do to stop them? Do we all stop buying iPhones? Like, do we all stop buying those shoes? And like you said, like nobody really, not nobody, but like we can't get people as a whole to like line up with that. So I would say like, what's the next step? Like maybe advocacy from the consumer side. Like if we saw articles or maybe interviews with, I don't know if that even matters though, now that I think about it, but what I was going to say is like maybe getting a consumer perspective to add into the conversation, like, you know, somebody who plays games, or somebody who like, yeah, somebody who plays and buys games like on the regular, sharing their opinions via like Polygon articles and stuff like that. Like, hey, I play games, and you know, I don't think these guys should be crunching. This is fun, blah blah blah. Like maybe that could raise awareness to it, but
Oh, you mean like this podcast?
potentially, but I don't think you can rely on people to stop buying the games, so that's like a no-go. I don't think people like emailing or tweeting at the CEOs is going to change things. I think probably what might be the most like realistic and or like ground gathering scenario would be if like developers and consumers could have a little more transparency and more of an open dialogue, which then could lead to lawmakers learning more, because at the overall level, our lawmakers need to learn more about current modern day like technology and society, because they are now undeniably interwoven and they cannot be undone. So having that open dialogue could help lead to what we have today with you and I, like revealing things, learning new things, and most importantly, like growing to new understandings. So as consumers, I think what we can do to help is like get to know the process, get to know the not every individual developer, get to know like who developers are, get to know like what type of impact this stuff has on them, and then like at its final conclusion, like try to get the law body to help bring regulation to like this. And that's probably a scary word to a lot of people, like regulation, but simply like I'm like, yeah, just trying to advocate for making things, I guess, like more fair. Regulations does not mean a bad thing always. It simply means to regulate, and if that means to, you know, make sure people are regulating their work hours fairly, then that sounds good to me.
What you just said is like gave me a new thought. And so I think that this is a great time to segue to change of heart. Okay, it's like weird for me to have to like say what I learned, because this entire like hour and a half is like a college class on on the game dev culture. And no joke, I can't tell you how much richer this conversation was than like what I imagined. It like really surpassed like my expectations by a long shot. But the thing that, you know, I'm trying to like piggyback on the last thing that you were saying about regulation, and I never thought about like government intervention with game development. But perhaps, you know, because the entire time you were speaking and like, you know, you're kind of ending on this optimistic note, and I just like have this voice in my head that's like, money talks, money talks, money talks. There's no way that any of this is going to happen without money. So perhaps instead of regulating them like work hours or something like that, like there are already labor laws, right? Like you have to have a lunch break after whatever, right? But one of the things that they might be able to do is like give like tax break incentives for studios that don't crunch. And that's like a way that the, you know, developer, I guess, can make the decision, since that's, you know, it'd be a financial incentive to, you know, for them to treat their employees better. And perhaps what they could do instead is like employ more employees, but make sure that none of them are crunching. And, you know, that could maybe offset the, you know, some of like the time or the money that they would be losing otherwise.
So I think that's actually a really like great and at the very least unique idea. Like I've never heard that suggested, like tax breaks for basically better treatment of your workers. And I almost feel like that could be something that like would be great to be applied to like a lot of different business facets of our society. So I think that's an awesome idea, Ryan. Unfortunately, the cynical part of me thinks of that and wonders like just how many ways these businesses can find loopholes to get through that, right? Like the whole like work 8 hours, but you need a break like in between. That gets loopholed during crunch time or during overtime, because basically it just says, hey, when you hit 8 hours, like take another 30-minute break and then just continue working, right?
Yeah.
So well, the two things I say there, and I think that's a cool idea. So so like my change of heart, honestly, is like the thing I brought up about the consumers like having this open dialogue. Like that to me is like more of a revelation. Like I wasn't against having the dialogue, but I hadn't actually like really thought about that. I always think that like a little more transparency within the games industry, like in both directions, would be good. But at the same time, like obviously telling people every little detail is bad. Just as a developer, it's bad. You're way better off giving someone the final version of your game and them never knowing it existed than telling them what you think the first version of the game is going to be and then giving them an entirely different game by the final version because you iterated so much on that concept that it's like nowhere near the same. And that kind of like trickles into like my various problems with the hype machine. But I think our changes of heart kind of like line up really well here, and hopefully our listeners come up with unique ideas of their own that help us like progress this conversation, and maybe they even take the steps to they themselves do some of the things that we mentioned, like maybe reaching out to developers to like learn more about the things they've worked on or how things were when they worked on it. Maybe even eventually getting games media to cover that type of stuff more so than just what's going to come out and how does it play slightly differently from the 500 other first-person shooter, action adventure, third-person platformers out there. So yeah, we're holding our hopes in you, listener. This is your time to shine. If you've enjoyed this episode and you want to converse more about games, try reaching out to a developer in a very nice way, or have a conversation about this episode with other people on our subreddit, because that's the cool place to do it.
Oh yeah, I dig it. Thanks for joining me, Los. This was fun.
Yeah, this was really cool. It was great talking with you, Ryan. I'm glad I could reveal so much.
Me too. This was very informative, and I'm excited to go play some games now. Perhaps some that were crunched. Do you know if Deep Rock Galactic was crunched?
I have heard nothing about crunch on that game.
Thank you for listening to Deep in the D-Pad. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and share us with your friends.
For updates and discussion, follow us on Reddit at r/deepinthedpad, Facebook at deepdpad, and subscribe to Deep in the D-Pad on YouTube. Don't forget to hit the bell.
And if you want to ask us questions or get a chance to share your own D-Pad delight on the show, email us at askdeepinthedpad@gmail.com. Be sure to put question or delight in the subject line.
Big thanks to 8-Bit Jazz and Kevin MacLeod for supplying the music for the show.